The radio crackled through the Nevada desert night as Captain Sarah Mitchell's steady voice cut through the static. 30,000 feet above a hostile valley in Afghanistan, she was about to prove wrong every instructor, every commanding officer, and every fellow pilot who had ever doubted her place in the cockpit of America's most lethal flying fortress. Spooky 7-1, we have eyes on target, multiple hostiles converging on friendly positions, request permission to engage. The response came immediately. Spooky 7-1, you are cleared hot, light them up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would reshape everything the military thought they knew about women in combat aviation. But to understand how Sarah Mitchell became the most feared gunship pilot in the Air Force, we need to go back to where it all began. A small farming town in Nebraska where a 9-year-old girl watched fighter jets streak across endless prairie skies and knew exactly what she wanted to become. The year was 1995, and Millfield, Nebraska, population 3,200, wasn't the kind of place that produced military legends. It was cornfields and cattle ranches, Friday night high school football, and Sunday church services where everyone knew everyone else's business. Sarah Mitchell grew up in a white farmhouse on the edge of town, where her father ran a modest crop dusting operation and her mother taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. Every morning at precisely 6:30 a.m., Sarah would climb onto the roof of their red barn to watch the sun rise and paint the cornfields gold. But she wasn't looking at the crops. Her eyes were always fixed on the horizon, scanning for the military training flights that would occasionally cross their airspace from Offutt Air Force Base, 200 miles to the east. When those gray silhouettes appeared, cutting contrails through the Nebraska sky, Sarah would stand perfectly still until they disappeared, her heart racing with something she couldn't yet name. Her father, Robert Mitchell, noticed this ritual early on. A former Navy mechanic who'd served on aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, he understood the pull of aviation better than most. One Saturday morning in October when Sarah was 12, he found her in the barn, sketching detailed drawings of fighter jets in the margins of her math homework. "Those are pretty good, kiddo," he said, settling down beside her on a hay bale. "You know what those are?" F-16 Fighting Falcons, Sarah replied without looking up. "Single-engine, multi-role fighter, maximum speed Mach 2. Combat radius 340 miles with external fuel tanks." Robert raised an eyebrow. His daughter had memorized specifications from his old aviation magazines with the same dedication other kids applied to baseball cards. "You want to fly one of those someday?" Sarah finally looked up, her green eyes bright with certainty. "I want to fly them all." That conversation changed everything. The following week, Robert enrolled Sarah in ground school at the regional airport in Grand Island. While her classmates were playing video games and hanging out at the mall, Sarah was learning about aerodynamics, weather patterns, and federal aviation regulations. By 14, she had her student pilot license. By 16, she was the youngest person in Nebraska history to earn her private pilot's license. The local newspaper ran a story about her achievement, complete with a photo of Sarah standing next to the Cessna 152 she'd trained in. The headline read, "Local teen takes flight, Mitchell girl soars above expectations." It was the first time Sarah's name appeared in print, but it wouldn't be the last. High school presented its own challenges. While Sarah excelled academically, graduating as valedictorian with a perfect 4.0 GPA, the social dynamics were more complicated. In a small farming community where most girls were expected to stay local, marry young, and raise families, Sarah's aviation ambitions made her an outsider. She spent lunch periods in the library, reading everything she could find about military aircraft and combat aviation. Her classmates thought she was strange. Her teachers thought she was brilliant. Her parents thought she was determined to prove something to the world. They were all right. The summer after graduation, Sarah's life took a decisive turn. The annual EAA AirVenture Air Show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, was a pilgrimage for aviation enthusiasts, and Robert had promised to take Sarah as a graduation present. They drove 12 hours in his pickup truck, the back loaded with camping gear, and Sarah's worn collection of flight manuals. Oshkosh was everything Sarah had dreamed of, and more. Hundreds of aircraft filled the temporary airport, Vintage warbirds, experimental home builds, modern fighters, and massive cargo planes. The air smelled of aviation fuel and hot metal. The constant roar of engines created a symphony that made Sarah's pulse quicken. But it was on the third day of the show that her future crystallized. The Air Force demonstration team had set up a recruitment booth near the main display area, complete with a full-scale mock-up of an F-22 Raptor cockpit. Sarah had been circling the display for an hour, working up the courage to approach, when a voice behind her said, "You thinking about taking the plunge?" She turned to find a woman in Air Force dress blues, the silver bars of a first lieutenant gleaming on her shoulders. Lieutenant Rebecca Torres was a C-130 transport pilot recently returned from a deployment to Iraq. She was also the first female military aviator Sarah had ever met in person. "I want to be a fighter pilot," Sarah said without hesitation. Torres smiled. "That's a tough road, especially for women. Are you sure you're ready for what that means?" "I've been ready since I was 9 years old." They talked for 2 hours. Torres explained the rigors of military flight training, the academic requirements, the physical demands, and the cultural challenges that female pilots faced in a male-dominated field. She was honest about the obstacles. The instructors who would push harder, the fellow students who would doubt her abilities, the constant pressure to prove herself worthy of the wing she'd earn. "The military is changing," Torres said as they watched an F-16 demonstration overhead. "Slowly, but it's changing. Women are flying combat missions now. We've got female fighter pilots, helicopter pilots, transport pilots. But the boys' club mentality dies hard. You'll face things that male pilots never have to deal with. The question is whether you're willing to fight through all of that to get what you want." Sarah watched the F-16 pull into a vertical climb, its afterburner painting a blue flame against the Wisconsin sky. "What's the toughest assignment in the Air Force?" Torres considered the question. "Depends what you mean by tough. Combat-wise, probably the AC-130 gunship program. Those guys fly into the worst situations, stay on target for hours, provide close air support for troops under fire. It's dangerous, demanding, and traditionally one of the most exclusive boys' clubs in the entire military. They've never had a female pilot." "Never?" "Never. The program was closed to women until just a few years ago, and even now the culture is challenging. Most women don't even try it." Sarah filed that information away. 3 months later, she was standing in the admissions office at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, her appointment letter in hand, and her mind made up. The academy proved to be everything the recruitment brochures promised, and everything Lieutenant Torres had warned her about. The academic workload was crushing: engineering courses, military history, leadership training, and flight instruction, all compressed into 4 years of relentless pressure. The physical training pushed her body to its limits and beyond. But it was the social dynamics that provided the real education. Sarah was one of only 200 women in a class of 1,200 cadets. In the aviation program, the ratio was even more skewed. Her flight instructor, Captain James Harrison, was a former F-15 pilot who made no secret of his belief that women didn't belong in combat aircraft. "Mitchell," he said during her first training flight, "you're here because of politics, not because you belong here. I'm going to push you twice as hard as everyone else, and when you wash out, you'll know it's because you couldn't cut it, not because I didn't give you a fair shot." Harrison kept his word. While other students were allowed minor mistakes, Sarah's errors were magnified and criticized in front of the entire class. When she performed well, her successes were attributed to luck or effort rather than skill. When she struggled, it was proof that women weren't suited for military aviation. But Harrison had underestimated his student. Every criticism made Sarah more determined. Every obstacle became motivation to push harder. She studied flight manuals until 2 a.m., practiced instrument procedures until they became muscle memory, and pushed her physical training beyond the minimum requirements. By the end of her sophomore year, she was ranked 3rd in her class academically and 1st in flight training scores. The breakthrough came during her junior year, in an advanced tactical flying course that simulated combat scenarios. The exercise involved low-level navigation through mountainous terrain, followed by a simulated attack on a ground target, all while avoiding simulated surface-to-air missiles. It was designed to push students to their limits and identify those with the instincts for combat flying. Sarah's turn came on a gray November morning. with snow squalls reducing visibility and crosswinds that made the T-6 Texan trainer difficult to control. The course record was held by a student who would later become an F-22 pilot, 6 minutes and 43 seconds from start to finish, with a direct hit on the target. Harrison's voice crackled through the radio as Sarah lined up for the start. "Mitchell, this isn't a Sunday pleasure flight. Push hard or don't waste everyone's time." Sarah dropped the aircraft into the first valley, flying barely 50 feet above the rocky terrain. The GPS coordinates flashed on her display as she banked hard left around a granite peak, pulling enough Gs to gray the edges of her vision. The simulated SAM sites were tracking her, their radar signatures appearing as red threats on her tactical display. She dove lower, using the terrain to mask her approach, timing her turns to avoid the engagement envelopes of the simulated missiles. The target appeared ahead, a mock enemy installation marked by orange panels. Sarah pulled the T-6 into a climbing turn, rolled inverted, and dove toward the target with the throttle firewalled. The simulated weapons release came at the perfect moment. Direct hit. As she pulled out of the dive and climbed away from the target area, the clock stopped at 6 minutes and 18 seconds, 25 seconds faster than the previous record. Harrison's voice came through the radio, different this time, quieter. "Good run, Mitchell. Return to base." That night, Harrison called Sarah into his office. The walls were covered with photos from his combat deployments, F-15s in formation over Iraq, group shots with squadron mates, pictures of destroyed enemy aircraft. He gestured for her to sit down. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I've been harder on you than any student I've ever trained, and I told myself it was for your own good. But the truth is, I didn't think you belonged here, and I was hoping you'd prove me right by washing out." Sarah remained silent, waiting. "Today you proved me wrong. That was the best tactical flying I've seen from a student in 15 years of instruction. You've got instincts that can't be taught, and situational awareness that most pilots never develop. You're going to make a hell of a combat aviator." Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harrison leaned back in his chair. "I'm recommending you for early entry into the specialized undergraduate pilot training program. If you're interested, there's a track that leads to some very specialized assignments. Heavy aircraft, close air support, long-duration missions in contested airspace." "The AC-130 program?" Harrison nodded. "It's a long shot. They've never selected a female pilot. The training is brutal, the missions are dangerous, and the culture is traditional. But if anyone can break that barrier, it might be you." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'll take it." 2 months later, she received orders to report to Hurlburt Field, Florida, for initial qualification in the AC-130 gunship. She would be the first woman ever to enter the program, and everyone, instructors, students, and ground crews, would be watching to see if she could handle the most demanding aircraft in the Air Force inventory. As Sarah packed her belongings for the move to Florida, she found the newspaper clipping from her teenage pilot license story. The 16-year-old girl in the photo looked impossibly young, standing beside that tiny Cessna, with a smile that radiated pure confidence. Now, at 22, Sarah understood what that smile had meant. It wasn't confidence in what she could do. It was confidence in what she was willing to endure to get there. The phone rang as she finished packing. Her father's voice carried across the line from Nebraska, warm with pride and concern. "You ready for this, kiddo?" Sarah looked out her academy dormitory window at the Colorado mountains, thinking about the journey that had brought her from a barn roof in Nebraska to the threshold of the most exclusive flying program in the military. "I've been ready since I was 9 years old, Dad." 3 weeks later, Captain Sarah Mitchell walked onto the flight line at Hurlburt Field, Florida, where the massive bulk of an AC-130 gunship waited in the morning sun. The aircraft was bigger than anything she'd ever flown, more complex than anything she'd ever imagined, and more lethal than any weapon system ever created. It was also about to become her new home. The humid Florida air hit Sarah's face like a wall as she stepped out of the transport van at Hurlburt Field. The base sprawled across hundreds of acres of pine forests and military infrastructure, home to Air Force Special Operations Command and some of the most classified aircraft in the American arsenal. But it was the sound that struck her first, the deep, throaty rumble of turboprop engines that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Major David Castellanos was waiting for her at the squadron headquarters, a weathered building that looked like it had survived several decades of Florida hurricanes. At 38, he was the youngest squadron commander in AC-130 history, a pilot who'd earned his reputation flying gunship missions over Iraq and Afghanistan. His handshake was firm, his expression unreadable. "Captain Mitchell, welcome to the 4th Special Operations Squadron. I hope you're ready to work, because we're about to find out what you're really made of." The briefing room was filled with pilots, navigators, flight engineers, and gunners, 23 men who represented the core of the AC-130 training program. Their conversations died as Sarah entered, replaced by the kind of silence that felt like a physical presence. She took the only empty seat in the front row and kept her eyes forward. Castellanos didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Gentlemen and lady, welcome to AC-130 Initial Qualification Training. Over the next 6 months, we're going to teach you to fly and fight in the most complex weapons system ever put into an aircraft. Some of you will make it, some of you won't. The washout rate is 40%, and that's for people who are already qualified military pilots." He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him filled with technical specifications. The AC-130U Spooky weighs 155,000 pounds fully loaded. It carries a 25mm Gatling gun, a 40mm Bofors cannon, and a 105mm howitzer. It can stay on station for up to 14 hours, and it can put ordnance on target with precision measured in inches, not feet. It is not an airplane. It's a flying artillery battery. The technical briefing continued for 2 hours, covering everything from engine performance to weapons systems to electronic warfare capabilities. Sarah took notes furiously, her engineering background helping her process the flood of information. But she was also aware of the sideways glances from her classmates, the whispered conversations that stopped when she looked in their direction. After the briefing, the class was dismissed for individual meetings with their assigned instructor pilots. Sarah's name was called last. "Captain Mitchell, you're with Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison." Morrison was a legend in the gunship community, a pilot with over 3,000 combat hours who'd flown missions in every major American conflict since Desert Storm. He was also known for his old-school approach to training and his skepticism about changes to military tradition. Sarah found him in his office, studying her academy transcripts. "Impressive academic record," he said without looking up. "Flight training scores are excellent. Your tactical flying evaluation from Harrison was glowing." He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. "None of that matters here." Morrison stood and walked to a wall covered with photos of AC-130 crews. "See all these pictures? Hundreds of aircrew members spanning 30 years of operations. Notice anything?" Sarah scanned the photos. Every face was male. "This aircraft has never had a female pilot, Mitchell. Not one. There are reasons for that, and they go beyond politics and policy. This is the most physically and mentally demanding aircraft in the Air Force inventory. Missions last 12 to 14 hours. You're flying in contested airspace, taking ground fire, making split-second decisions that determine whether American soldiers live or die. The margin for error is 0. He returned to his desk. "I requested to be your instructor because I want to give you a fair shot. But fair doesn't mean easy. You're going to work harder than anyone else in this program because you have more to prove. The question is whether you can handle that pressure." "I can handle it, sir." Morrison smiled for the first time. "We'll see." The next morning, Sarah got her first look inside an AC-130. The aircraft was enormous, nearly 100 feet long with a wingspan that stretched 132 feet. But it was the interior that took her breath away. The cargo compartment had been converted into a sophisticated command center, with dozens of screens, communication systems, and targeting equipment. The weapons bay housed the 3 main guns, each one larger than anything she'd ever seen on an aircraft. Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez showed her around the aircraft systems. Rodriguez was one of only a handful of women in the AC-130 program, having joined as an enlisted flight engineer 2 years earlier. She'd faced her own battles for acceptance, and she understood what Sarah was up against. "The learning curve is steep," Rodriguez said as they examined the engine controls. 4 turboprops, each one putting out 4,600 horsepower. Fuel system is more complex than most airline jets. Environmental controls, hydraulics, electrical systems. Everything is redundant, because we can't afford to have anything fail over a target area. They spent the morning going through checklists and emergency procedures. The complexity was staggering. Hundreds of switches, gauges, and controls that all had to be monitored continuously, but Sarah's engineering background served her well. She began to see the patterns, the logical flow of systems that made the massive aircraft function. The first flight came 3 days later. Sarah climbed into the left seat of the cockpit, Morrison beside her in the instructor's position. The rest of the crew, navigator, flight engineer, and 3 weapons operators, settled into their stations in the cargo compartment behind them. "Before we start engines," Morrison said, "understand that this aircraft doesn't fly like anything you've experienced. It's heavy, it's slow, and it handles like a freight train. But in the right hands, it's also incredibly precise. The key is patience and planning. Never get in a hurry." The engine start sequence took 15 minutes. One by one, the 4 Allison T-56 turboprops wound up to idle power, their distinctive sound filling the cockpit. Sarah ran through the before-taxi checklist, her hands moving across the controls with growing confidence. Taxiing was an adventure. The AC-130 was so large that it required a ground crew to guide it around the narrow taxiways. Sarah learned to make wide turns and plan well ahead, the aircraft's momentum carrying it forward long after she reduced power. The takeoff roll seemed to last forever. Even with all 4 engines at maximum power, the heavily loaded gunship accelerated slowly, using nearly the entire 8,000-foot runway before finally lifting off. But once airborne, Sarah began to understand the aircraft's unique characteristics. It was stable and predictable, responding to control inputs with deliberate precision. "Now comes the interesting part," Morrison said as they climbed to 12,000 feet. "We're going to practice the basic gunship maneuver, the pylon turn. In combat, we fly in a left-hand circle around the target, keeping our weapons pointed down and inward. It sounds simple, it's not. The pylon turn required constant attention to airspeed, altitude, and bank angle while maintaining a precise circular flight path. Too steep and the aircraft would lose altitude. Too shallow and the guns couldn't track the target. Sarah's first attempts were rough, the aircraft wallowing through uncoordinated turns that would have been useless in combat. "Relax," Morrison coached. "Don't fight the airplane, work with it. Feel the turn, don't force it." By the 4th attempt, Sarah began to find the rhythm. The AC-130 settled into a smooth left turn, its flight path describing a perfect circle around a point on the ground. The weapons operators in back called out simulated target engagements, their voices professional and focused. "Better," Morrison said. "Much better. You're starting to understand how this aircraft wants to fly." The flight lasted 4 hours, a short sortie by AC-130 standards. When they finally landed, Sarah's flight suit was soaked with sweat, her legs cramped from the unfamiliar rudder pressures, and her head spinning with new information. But she was also exhilarated. For the first time, she'd felt the unique challenge of flying the world's most sophisticated gunship. Over the following weeks, the training intensified. Sarah flew daily missions, practicing everything from basic aircraft handling to complex tactical scenarios. She learned to coordinate with ground controllers, to identify targets through infrared cameras, and to deliver precision fires in simulated combat situations. The physical demands were unlike anything she'd experienced. Flights regularly lasted 8 to 10 hours, with the crew taking turns at the controls while maintaining constant vigilance. The aircraft's left-turning flight profile put unusual stresses on the pilots, requiring strength and endurance that traditional fighter training hadn't prepared her for. It was the mental challenges that proved most demanding. The AC-130 was a symphony of complexity, requiring the pilot to coordinate with 6 other crew members while managing aircraft systems, navigation, and tactical considerations. In combat, they would add the variables of enemy fire, weather, and the life-or-death consequences of every decision. Sarah's classmates began to separate into distinct categories. Some struggled with the aircraft's handling characteristics, unable to master the precision required for effective gunship operations. Others couldn't handle the pressure of the long-duration missions, their performance deteriorating as fatigue set in. A few simply couldn't adapt to the unique demands of close air support, where split-second timing could mean the difference between saving friendly forces and accidentally engaging them. Lieutenant Jake Patterson had been a standout F-16 pilot before volunteering for the gunship program. He was confident, skilled, and popular with the other students. He was also openly skeptical about women in combat roles, a viewpoint he didn't hesitate to express during informal conversations. "Look, I'm not trying to be a jerk," he said one evening in the squadron bar, his voice carrying across the room to where Sarah sat reviewing flight manuals. "But when we're in combat, lives are on the line. I want the best possible pilot in that seat, and biology is biology. Women just don't have the same physical capabilities as men." Sarah continued reading, but every word registered. Similar conversations had followed her throughout her military career, and she'd learned that the best response was usually no response at all. Her performance would speak for itself. The proving moment came during the 4th week of training, in a complex night exercise that simulated close air support for troops in contact with enemy forces. The scenario involved multiple ground units, friendly aircraft, and simulated surface-to-air missile threats. Each student pilot would get one attempt to successfully complete the mission. Patterson flew first, turning in a solid performance that earned praise from the instructors. His target engagements were accurate, his crew coordination was smooth, and his tactical decision-making was sound. The debrief lasted 20 minutes, mostly positive comments with minor suggestions for improvement. Sarah's turn came at 2 a.m., when fatigue levels were highest and the margin for error smallest. The simulated ground unit was under heavy fire, requesting immediate close air support from an AC-130 in the area. Sarah had to navigate to the target area, establish communication with ground controllers, identify enemy positions using the aircraft's sensors, and deliver precision fires without endangering friendly forces. The approach to the target area was complicated by simulated enemy air defenses. Sarah had to use terrain masking and electronic countermeasures to avoid detection while positioning the aircraft for an effective attack. The pylon turn had to be established quickly, accurately, and in coordination with the weapons operators who were tracking multiple targets simultaneously. "Gunship 7-4, this is Falcon 2-1, came the voice of the ground controller. "We have enemy forces in buildings 200 meters north of our position. Danger close engagement requested. We are wounded and cannot maneuver." Danger close, the most challenging type of close air support mission, requiring absolute precision to avoid hitting friendly forces. Sarah rolled the AC-130 into its attack orbit, the aircraft's sensors painting a detailed picture of the target area on her displays. "Falcon 2-1, Gunship 7-4 has you in sight. Identify your position with infrared strobe." The ground display showed a flashing light marking the friendly force's location. 200 meters away, the thermal cameras revealed heat signatures moving between buildings, the simulated enemy forces. "Beginning target engagement," Sarah announced. 25 Mike, 100 rounds. The simulation was so realistic that she could almost feel the aircraft shudder as the Gatling gun engaged its targets. The weapons operators called out hits, their voices calm and professional despite the pressure of the exercise. Direct hits on target building, enemy forces neutralized. "Falcon 2-1, you are clear to maneuver." The mission continued for another 2 hours, with Sarah successfully engaging multiple target sets while coordinating with ground forces and managing aircraft systems. When the exercise finally ended, she was exhausted but confident in her performance. The debrief the next morning was different from the others. Morrison stood before the assembled class, his expression serious. "Last night's exercise separated the pilots from the drivers," he began. "Some of you performed adequately. Some of you made mistakes that would have gotten people killed in combat. And one of you flew a nearly flawless mission under extremely challenging conditions." He looked directly at Sarah. "Captain Mitchell, that was the best student performance I've seen in 20 years of instruction. Your target engagements were precise, your crew coordination was textbook, and your decision-making under pressure was outstanding. You flew that aircraft like you'd been doing it for years." The room was silent. Patterson's face showed a mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. The other students looked at Sarah with new eyes, seeing not just the woman who had invaded their exclusive club, but the pilot who was proving she belonged there. After the debrief, Morrison pulled Sarah aside. "You're ahead of schedule," he said, "way ahead. I'm recommending you for advanced tactical training, the program that prepares pilots for deployment to combat zones. It's normally reserved for pilots who've completed the full 6-month initial qualification course." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. "How much earlier?" "You'd start next month. 3 weeks of intensive combat training followed by certification flights with an experienced combat crew. If you pass, you'd be qualified for immediate deployment to Afghanistan. The opportunity was everything Sarah had worked for, but it also meant stepping into the unknown. Combat operations were different from training flights. Real bullets, real consequences, real soldiers whose lives would depend on her skill and judgment. "There's something else you should know," Morrison continued. "If you deploy, you'll be the first female AC-130 pilot to fly combat missions. Every eye in the military will be watching, waiting to see how you perform. Some will be hoping you succeed, others will be waiting for you to fail." Sarah thought about the 9-year-old girl who had watched fighter jets from a barn roof in Nebraska, dreaming of a future that seemed impossible. That girl had never worried about what other people thought. She had simply known what she wanted and been willing to work for it. "I'll take it, sir." Morrison smiled. "I thought you might. Pack your gear, Captain. You're about to find out what this aircraft can really do." 2 days later, Sarah boarded a transport flight to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, where the Air Force conducted its most advanced combat training exercises. The next phase of her education would take place in the desert, where she would learn to fight the AC-130 against the most sophisticated enemy defenses the military could simulate. As the transport climbed away from Florida, Sarah looked down at Hurlburt Field growing smaller below. Somewhere down there, the next class of AC-130 students was beginning their journey, facing the same challenges and doubts she had overcome. But for the first time in the program's history, they could look to the example of a woman who had proven it could be done. The desert training ahead would be the final test before deployment to a real combat zone. Everything she had learned, everything she had endured, had been preparation for what came next. In 3 weeks, she would either earn her place among the most elite pilots in the Air Force, or she would face the reality that dreams sometimes weren't enough. But as the transport banked west toward Nevada, Sarah Mitchell felt the same certainty she'd carried since childhood. She was ready for whatever came next. The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a landscape so desolate it could have been another planet. Nellis Air Force Base sat in the middle of this wilderness like a technological oasis, its runways shimmering in the 110-degree heat. This was where the Air Force brought its best pilots to learn how to fight and survive against the most sophisticated enemy defenses in the world. Colonel Marcus Blackwood commanded the 57th Wing's Advanced Combat Training Program. A former F-117 Nighthawk pilot who'd flown stealth missions over Baghdad, he understood better than most what it meant to operate in hostile airspace. His weathered face showed the accumulated stress of 2 decades in combat aviation, but his eyes still held the sharp intensity that had made him one of the most effective strike pilots in Air Force history. Hakda, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would reshape everything the military thought they knew about women in combat aviation. But to understand how Sarah Mitchell became the most feared gunship pilot in the Air Force, we need to go back to where it all began. A small farming town in Nebraska where a 9-year-old girl watched fighter jets streak across endless prairie skies and knew exactly what she wanted to become. The year was 1995, and Millfield, Nebraska, population 3,200, wasn't the kind of place that produced military legends. It was cornfields and cattle ranches, Friday night high school football, and Sunday church services where everyone knew everyone else's business. Sarah Mitchell grew up in a white farmhouse on the edge of town, where her father ran a modest crop dusting operation and her mother taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. Every morning at precisely 6:30 a.m., Sarah would climb onto the roof of their red barn to watch the sun rise and paint the cornfields gold. But she wasn't looking at the crops. Her eyes were always fixed on the horizon, scanning for the military training flights that would occasionally cross their airspace from Offutt Air Force Base, 200 miles to the east. When those gray silhouettes appeared, cutting contrails through the Nebraska sky, Sarah would stand perfectly still until they disappeared, her heart racing with something she couldn't yet name. Her father, Robert Mitchell, noticed this ritual early on. A former Navy mechanic who'd served on aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, he understood the pull of aviation better than most. One Saturday morning in October when Sarah was 12, he found her in the barn, sketching detailed drawings of fighter jets in the margins of her math homework. "Those are pretty good, kiddo," he said, settling down beside her on a hay bale. "You know what those are?" "F-16 Fighting Falcons," Sarah replied without looking up. "Single-engine, multi-role fighter. Maximum speed Mach 2. Combat radius 340 miles with external fuel tanks. Robert raised an eyebrow. His daughter had memorized specifications from his old aviation magazines with the same dedication other kids applied to baseball cards. You want to fly one of those someday? Sarah finally looked up, her green eyes bright with certainty. I want to fly them all. That conversation changed everything. The following week, Robert enrolled Sarah in ground school at the regional airport in Grand Island. While her classmates were playing video games and hanging out at the mall, Sarah was learning about aerodynamics, weather patterns, and federal aviation regulations. By 14, she had her student pilot license. By 16, she was the youngest person in Nebraska history to earn her private pilot's license. The local newspaper ran a story about her achievement, complete with a photo of Sarah standing next to the Cessna 152 she'd trained in. The headline read, "Local teen takes flight, Mitchell girl soars above expectations." It was the first time Sarah's name appeared in print, but it wouldn't be the last. "Captain Mitchell," he said as Sarah reported to his office, "I've been following your progress through the AC-130 program. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison speaks very highly of your abilities, which is unusual for him. He's not easily impressed." The office walls were covered with maps of every major conflict zone where American forces had operated in the past 20 years. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, places where the abstract concepts of military training became deadly reality. "The training you're about to receive is different from anything you've experienced," Blackwood continued. "We call it Red Flag, the most realistic combat training in the world. For the next 3 weeks, you'll fly missions against an enemy force equipped with the latest Russian and Chinese air defense systems. They know our tactics, they know our weaknesses, and their job is to shoot you down." He gestured toward a detailed map of the Nevada test range. "Out there, we've built a replica of a modern battlefield. Surface-to-air missile sites, radar installations, electronic warfare systems, enemy fighters, everything you'll face in actual combat. The only difference is that the missiles have warheads full of sensors instead of explosives. When they hit you, you'll know it." Sarah studied the map, noting the complexity of the simulated threat environment. Red triangles marked SAM sites, blue squares indicated radar installations, and dashed lines showed the coverage areas of various defensive systems. It looked like a fortress designed by someone who understood exactly how American aircraft operated. "Your first mission is tomorrow night," Blackwood said. "You'll be flying as co-pilot with Major Tony Vasquez, one of our most experienced combat instructors. He's flown over 200 combat sorties in the AC-130, including some of the most dangerous missions of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. If anyone can prepare you for combat operations, it's him." Major Vasquez was waiting at the flight line when Sarah arrived for the pre-mission briefing. At 34, he looked older, his black hair showing early traces of gray, and his eyes carrying the weight of too many dangerous nights over hostile territory. His handshake was firm, his demeanor completely professional. "Mitchell, right? I've heard good things about your training performance. Tonight we're going to find out how you handle the real thing." The mission briefing took place in a secure facility that could have been transplanted from a combat zone. Intelligence analysts presented threat assessments, weather specialists outlined atmospheric conditions, and rescue coordinators explained what would happen if their aircraft was shot down during the exercise. The target was a simulated enemy command post located deep in hostile territory, surrounded by multiple layers of air defenses. Sarah and Vasquez would have to penetrate the defensive network, locate the target using the AC-130's sensors, destroy it with precision gunfire, and extract safely, all while avoiding simulated enemy fighters and surface-to-air missiles. "The threats are all computer-controlled," explained Captain Linda Chen, the mission intelligence officer. "But the computers are programmed with the actual tactics and capabilities of real enemy systems. If you make the same mistakes that would get you killed in combat, you'll be declared shot down here." Sarah studied the threat analysis, noting the locations of SA-15 and SA-20 missile systems that could engage targets at their planned operating altitude. The enemy had also positioned electronic warfare units designed to jam American communications and navigation systems. "What's our survivability estimate?" she asked. Chen consulted her notes. "Based on the planned flight profile and current threat assessment, approximately 60% chance of mission success without aircraft loss." Those were sobering odds. In training, a 60% survival rate was acceptable. In combat, it meant that 2 out of every 5 crews might not come home. The pre-flight preparation took 2 hours. Sarah and Vasquez thoroughly inspected the aircraft, checking every system and weapon that would be critical to the mission's success. The AC-130 looked different at Nellis, darker, more purposeful, with additional antennas and electronic countermeasures pods that hadn't been on the training aircraft in Florida. "This bird's been to Afghanistan 3 times, Vasquez said as they examined the engine nacelles. "She's seen real combat, taken real fire, and brought her crews home every time. Respect her, trust her, and she'll do the same for you." The crew briefing covered every aspect of the mission, from takeoff procedures to emergency protocols. Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant Kevin Park had flown with Vasquez on dozens of combat missions. Navigator Captain Amy Sullivan was a former F-15E Weapons Systems officer who'd transitioned to the AC-130 program. The 3 gunners, Technical Sergeants Williams, Jackson, and Reeves, had a combined total of over 400 combat sorties between them. "First time in Red Flag?" Sergeant Williams asked Sarah as they strapped into their seats. "Yes, but hopefully not the last." Williams grinned. "That's the right attitude. Just remember, everything you see tonight is designed to kill us. Trust your training, listen to your crew, and don't hesitate when it's time to pull the trigger." The engine start sequence began at sunset, the 4 turboprops winding up to operational power as the desert sky turned deep purple. Sarah ran through the before-taxi checklist with mechanical precision, but she could feel her pulse quickening with anticipation. This wasn't training anymore. It was as close to combat as she could get, without actually being shot at. The takeoff was routine, but as soon as they turned north toward the range, the atmosphere in the aircraft changed. Radio chatter decreased to essential communications only. Crew members focused intently on their displays, watching for the first signs of enemy activity. Even the aircraft seemed different, more alive, more purposeful, as if it understood the seriousness of what lay ahead. "Threat warning system is active," announced Park from the flight engineer's station. "We're entering contested airspace." The first challenge came 20 minutes into the mission. Sullivan's navigation display showed a pair of simulated enemy fighters approaching from the east, their radar signatures indicating MiG-29 Fulcrums armed with air-to-air missiles. The AC-130's defensive systems automatically began jamming the fighters' radars, but evasion would require precise timing and coordination. "Bandits bearing 090 25 miles in closing," Sullivan reported. "Recommend immediate descent and turn to terrain masking position." Vasquez pushed the aircraft into a steep descent, using a desert mountain range to hide from the fighter's radar. The AC-130 dropped to 500 feet above the rocky terrain, low enough that Sarah could make out individual boulders and scrub brush in the moonlight. "Lost radar contact," Sullivan announced. "Bandits are searching but haven't reacquired." They stayed low for 15 minutes, following valleys and ridgelines that kept them invisible to enemy sensors. It was dangerous flying. One moment of inattention could result in controlled flight into terrain, but it was also exhilarating. Sarah began to understand why combat pilots developed such intense bonds with their aircraft and crews. The approach to the target area required climbing back to operational altitude, exposing them once again to enemy defenses. The threat warning system immediately began detecting multiple radar sources: search radars, tracking radars, and the distinctive signatures of surface-to-air missile systems. "SAM site bearing 270, 15 miles, Park announced. SA-20 system, tracking but not yet locked." Vasquez adjusted their flight path to avoid the missile's engagement envelope while positioning for the attack. Sarah monitored the aircraft systems and assisted with navigation, but most of her attention was focused on learning, watching how an experienced combat pilot managed the complex juggling act of survival and mission accomplishment. "Target area in sight," called Sergeant Jackson from his position behind the 40mm cannon. "Thermal imaging shows multiple buildings, 2 vehicles, and what appears to be communications equipment." The target identification process took several minutes, with the crew carefully comparing what they saw through their sensors with intelligence photographs and target descriptions. In combat, positive identification was critical, the difference between destroying an enemy command post and accidentally hitting a school or hospital. Confirmed enemy command facility, Sullivan announced. Recommend engagement with 40 mm, followed by 105 mm for building destruction. Vasquez rolled the aircraft into its characteristic left-hand orbit, the guns now pointing down and inward toward the target. Sarah felt the AC-130 settle into the smooth, coordinated turn that was the trademark of effective gunship operations. Beginning attack run, Vasquez announced. 40 Mike, engage the communications array. The sound of the cannon firing was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Even through her headset, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the 40 mm Bofors gun was distinctly audible. The aircraft shuddered slightly with each shot, but remained rock-steady in its orbit. Direct hits on communications targets, Jackson reported. Array is destroyed. 105. Engage the main building, Vasquez ordered. The 105 mm howitzer's report was like thunder, a deep boom that Sarah felt as much as heard. The high-explosive shell arced downward toward the target, guided by laser designation and GPS coordinates to within inches of the aim point. Building destroyed, confirmed Sergeant Reeves from the howitzer position. Secondary explosions indicate probable ammunition storage. The attack had taken less than 3 minutes, but Sarah knew they weren't safe yet. Every second spent in the target area increased the likelihood that enemy defenses would locate and engage them. Sure enough, the threat warning system began indicating that multiple SAM sites were attempting to establish target locks. Time to go, Vasquez announced, rolling the aircraft out of its orbit and accelerating away from the target area. Threat warning shows SA-15 site has acquired lock. Deploying countermeasures. The aircraft's defensive systems automatically dispense chaff and flares designed to decoy incoming missiles. At the same time, Vasquez threw the AC-130 into a series of evasive maneuvers that pushed the aircraft to its structural limits. Sarah was pressed hard into her seat as the pilot rolled left, pulled into a climbing turn, then dove toward the desert floor in an attempt to break the missile's tracking. Missile launch, Park announced. SA-15 inbound, time to impact 45 seconds. The next 30 seconds seemed to last forever. The AC-130's electronic warfare systems fought a desperate battle against the incoming missile's guidance system, while Vasquez continued his evasive maneuvers. Sarah monitored the engine instruments, ready to respond to any system malfunctions that might result from the violent maneuvering. Missiles gone stupid, Park finally announced. Lost track. Impact in the dirt. They weren't clear yet. The mission profile called for them to egress through another heavily defended area, requiring precise timing and coordination to avoid multiple overlapping threat zones. Sarah began to understand why combat missions were so physically and mentally exhausting. The constant vigilance, the split-second decision-making, the knowledge that any mistake could be fatal. The flight back to base took another hour, during which they encountered simulated enemy fighters twice more and had to evade another surface-to-air missile engagement. By the time they landed at Nellis, Sarah's flight suit was soaked with sweat, despite the aircraft's air conditioning, and her hands were cramped from gripping the controls during the evasive maneuvers. The post-mission debrief lasted 3 hours. Every aspect of the flight was analyzed in detail: their routing decisions, target identification procedures, weapons employment, and defensive reactions. The mission was declared successful, but the instructors identified dozens of small improvements that could have made it safer and more effective. Not bad for a first combat mission, Vasquez said as they walked out of the debrief facility. You handled the stress well, maintained situational awareness, and didn't panic when things got exciting. Most pilots take several missions to reach that level of comfort. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah flew 8 more red flag missions, each one more challenging than the last. She learned to operate in electronic warfare environments where communications and navigation systems were jammed. She practiced low-altitude penetration routes that required flying at 200 feet above the desert at 300 knots. She engaged moving targets, conducted danger-close fire support for simulated ground troops, and operated in weather conditions that reduced visibility to near zero. The most challenging mission came during her final week at Nellis. Intelligence reported a high-value target, a simulated enemy commander, located in a heavily defended urban area. The target was time-sensitive, meaning it would disappear if not engaged within a narrow window. The mission required precise timing, flawless execution, and acceptance of significantly higher risks than normal. Sarah was designated as the primary pilot for this mission, with Vasquez acting as her co-pilot and advisor. It was a vote of confidence from the training staff, but also a final test of everything she'd learned. The pre-mission briefing revealed the complexity of the operation. The target was located in a mock city that the Air Force had constructed in the Nevada desert, complete with multi-story buildings, civilian traffic patterns, and a population of role players who would simulate non-combatants. Enemy defenses included short-range air defense systems integrated into the urban landscape, making them extremely difficult to detect and avoid. "This is the hardest mission we fly in Red Flag," Colonel Blackwood explained during the briefing. "Urban operations are the most dangerous environment for gunship crews. Limited maneuver space, multiple threat axes, civilian considerations, and target identification challenges that don't exist in open terrain." Sarah studied the intelligence photos, memorizing the layout of the target area and identifying potential escape routes if the mission went wrong. The enemy commander was reported to be in a specific building for only a 2-hour window. Miss that window and the opportunity would be lost. The mission launched at midnight, with Sarah and her crew departing Nellis under a star-filled desert sky. The initial portion of the flight was routine, but as they approached the target area, the complexity of the urban environment became apparent. The mock city blazed with lights, vehicle traffic moved along the streets, and radio communications indicated the presence of multiple friendly units operating in the area. "This is Warhammer 7-2, Sarah announced as they established contact with the ground controller, on station and ready for tasking. "Warhammer 7-2, Falcon 3-1, we have eyes on the target building. Recommend approach from the northeast to minimize civilian exposure. Be advised, enemy air defenses are active in the area." Sarah established the aircraft in a wide orbit around the city, using her sensors to build a detailed picture of the tactical situation. The target building was clearly visible on the thermal display, but so were dozens of other structures that looked virtually identical. Positive target identification would require careful analysis and coordination with ground forces. The attack required absolute precision. The enemy commander was located on the 3rd floor of a 4-story building, with civilians occupying the floors above and below. The weapons engagement had to be carefully planned to eliminate the target while minimizing collateral damage. "Beginning target engagement," Sarah announced. 25, Mike. Precision fire on the 3rd floor northeast corner. The Gatling gun engagement lasted only seconds, but required the most precise flying Sarah had ever performed. She had to maintain the aircraft in a perfect orbit while the gunners placed individual rounds through specific windows of the target building. 1 degree of drift in the aircraft's flight path could mean the difference between mission success and civilian casualties. "Target neutralized," reported the ground controller. "Excellent shooting, Warhammer. You're cleared to egress." But the mission wasn't over yet. As they turned away from the target area, the threat warning system detected multiple surface-to-air missile systems attempting to engage them. The urban environment made evasive maneuvering extremely dangerous, with tall buildings limiting their options for defensive actions. "SAM launch, bearing 240, announced the flight engineer. "Multiple missiles inbound." Sarah pushed the AC-130 into the most aggressive defensive maneuvers possible within the confines of the urban area. She dove between buildings, pulled maximum G-force turns around skyscrapers, and climbed rapidly to clear obstacles while simultaneously deploying countermeasures. The aircraft's airframe groaned under the stress, but held together. "All missiles decoyed," the flight engineer finally announced. "We're clear of the engagement zone." The egress from the target area required another hour of careful flying through defended territory, but Sarah's confidence had grown with each successful challenge. When they finally landed back at Nellis, she knew she had passed the final test. The graduation ceremony took place on a Friday morning, with Colonel Blackwood presenting certificates to the pilots who had successfully completed the Red Flag program. Out of 12 pilots who had started the course, 9 had graduated. Sarah was not just among the successful candidates, she had achieved the highest overall scores in the class. "Captain Mitchell," Blackwood said as he handed her the certificate, "you've demonstrated exceptional skill and judgment under the most challenging conditions we can simulate. You're ready for combat operations." That afternoon, Sarah received her deployment orders. She would be joining the 4th Special Operations Squadron at Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan, where AC-130 gunships provided close air support for special operations forces operating throughout the country. It was the assignment she had dreamed of since watching those fighter jets cross the Nebraska sky as a child. But as she prepared to leave Nevada, Sarah understood that the real test was still ahead. Training, no matter how realistic, was still training. In Afghanistan, the bullets would be real, the consequences final, and the margin for error non-existent. Everything she had learned, everything she had endured, had been preparation for what came next. The transport flight to Afghanistan would depart the following Monday. After 6 years of training, education, and preparation, Captain Sarah Mitchell was finally ready to prove herself in combat. The transport plane descended through the thin mountain air toward Bagram Airfield, and Sarah pressed her face to the small window, watching Afghanistan spread out below like a wrinkled brown blanket. The Hindu Kush Mountains rose in jagged peaks to the north, their snow-covered summits stark against the pale sky. Below, the Shamali Plain stretched toward Kabul, dotted with compounds and irrigation ditches that had changed little in centuries. This was her new home for the next year, a land where American forces had been fighting for over a decade, where every night brought new requests for close air support, and where the AC-130 had earned its reputation as the most feared weapon in the coalition arsenal. Bagram was a sprawling military city built around a Soviet-era airfield, home to over 30,000 American and coalition personnel. The base hummed with constant activity, helicopters launching on medical evacuations, transport planes delivering supplies, and fighter jets departing on combat air patrols. But it was the distinctive sound of AC-130 engines that caught Sarah's attention as they taxied to the terminal. Somewhere out there, her new squadron mates were preparing for another night of combat operations. Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Hayes commanded the 4th Special Operations Squadron's deployed element, making her one of the highest-ranking women in combat aviation. At 42, she had flown AC-130s longer than almost anyone in the Air Force, with over 400 combat missions spanning 3 deployments to Iraq and 2 to Afghanistan. Her reputation among Special Operations Forces was legendary. Troops called her Guardian Angel for her ability to provide precise, devastating fire support when they needed it most. "Captain Mitchell," Hayes said as Sarah reported to squadron headquarters, "welcome to the war. I hope you're ready to work, because we've got a full flight schedule, and American lives depend on our performance every single night." The squadron briefing room was unlike anything Sarah had seen in training. The walls were covered with detailed maps of Afghanistan marked with colored pins indicating recent operations, enemy activity, and friendly unit locations. A large board listed the current threat assessment for different regions of the country, from minimal in the relatively secure areas around Kabul to extreme in the mountainous border regions where Taliban and al-Qaeda forces operated with near impunity. "The operational tempo here is intense," Hayes continued. "We fly 6 nights a week, with missions lasting anywhere from 8 to 14 hours. You'll be supporting Special Operations Forces, conventional Army and Marine units, and occasionally coalition partners. Every mission is different, but they all have one thing in common. People's lives hang in the balance." Sarah's first combat crew assignment paired her with Major Robert Chin, a veteran pilot with over 200 combat sorties who had specifically requested to fly with the squadron's newest member. Chen had heard about Sarah's training performance and was curious to see how she would handle the reality of combat operations. "Flying combat missions is different from anything you've experienced in training," Chen explained as they walked toward their aircraft. "The stress is constant, the decisions are final, and there's no reset button if you make a mistake. But there's also a satisfaction that comes from knowing you're making a real difference. Saving lives, protecting American soldiers, and putting bad guys permanently out of business." Their AC-130, nicknamed Ghost Rider, was a battle-tested veteran with over 1,000 combat hours. Bullet holes in the fuselage had been patched and painted over, testimony to the aircraft's encounters with enemy ground fire. But the maintenance crews kept it in perfect condition, understanding that the lives of the aircrew and the soldiers they supported depended on the aircraft's reliability. The crew briefing for Sarah's first combat mission revealed the complexity of modern warfare. Intelligence analysts presented detailed threat assessments for their assigned area of operations, a mountainous region near the Pakistani border where coalition forces were conducting operations against a Taliban stronghold. Weather specialists outlined atmospheric conditions that would affect their sensors and weapons accuracy. Medical personnel explained procedures for handling combat casualties, both on the ground and in the aircraft. The mission itself was relatively straightforward: provide close air support for a special operations team conducting a night raid on a suspected Taliban commander's compound. But Sarah learned that in combat, even simple missions could become complicated very quickly. "The target area is in a valley surrounded by mountains," explained Captain Michael Torres, the mission intelligence officer. "Limited escape routes, multiple potential firing positions for enemy forces, and civilian compounds within 500 meters of the objective. We'll need to be extremely precise with our weapons employment." Sarah studied the target folder, memorizing the layout of the compound and identifying key terrain features that would help with navigation and target identification. The intelligence indicated the presence of an important Taliban leader who had been responsible for several attacks on coalition forces, but also warned of the possibility that civilians might be present in adjacent buildings. The pre-flight inspection took on new meaning when Sarah realized that the aircraft's defensive systems had been activated for combat operations. Chaff and flare dispensers were loaded with live countermeasures. The radar warning receivers were set to detect actual enemy threats, and the crew wore body armor and survival equipment in case they were shot down over hostile territory. "Different feeling, isn't it?" Chen observed as they completed the walk-around inspection. "Knowing that people are actually going to try to kill us tonight." The engine start sequence began at sunset, with the 4 turboprops winding up for what would be Sarah's first combat sortie. As they taxied toward the runway, she could see other coalition aircraft preparing for night operations. Apache helicopters armed with Hellfire missiles, F-16 fighters loaded with precision bombs, and transport aircraft preparing to insert special operations teams deep into hostile territory. The takeoff from Bagram was routine, but as soon as they left controlled airspace, the atmosphere in the aircraft changed dramatically. Radio communications shifted to encrypted channels, weapons systems were armed and checked, and crew members began the constant vigilance that characterized combat operations. "First time?" asked Technical Sergeant Maria Santos from her position at the infrared targeting system. Santos was a veteran sensor operator with over 300 combat missions, and she had developed an almost supernatural ability to locate targets in the complex terrain of Afghanistan. "Yes, but hopefully not the last," Sarah replied. Santos smiled. "That's what they all say, just remember, we're the good guys out here. When soldiers on the ground call for help, we're the cavalry coming to the rescue. Don't ever forget that." The flight to the target area took 90 minutes, following a circuitous route designed to avoid known enemy positions and air defense sites. Sarah used the time to familiarize herself with the aircraft's combat configuration and to study the terrain they would be operating over. Afghanistan looked different through night vision systems, an alien landscape of valleys and ridgelines painted in shades of green and black. "Ghost Rider 7-4, this is Dagger 2-1, came the voice of the ground force commander as they approached the target area. "We're beginning our approach to the objective. Request you establish orbit and prepare for close air support." Chen established the AC-130 in a wide circle around the target compound, the aircraft's sensors immediately beginning to paint a detailed picture of the area below. The thermal imaging revealed heat signatures from buildings, vehicles, and people moving around the compound. But distinguishing between enemy fighters and innocent civilians would require careful analysis and coordination with the ground forces. "Dagger 2-1, Ghost Rider has you in sight," Sarah announced, taking over primary communications duties. "Stand by for overwatch." The next hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. The Special Operations team moved through the darkness toward their objective while Sarah and her crew maintained constant surveillance of the surrounding area. The AC-130 sensors could detect movement that was invisible to troops on the ground, providing early warning of potential threats or escape attempts. "Multiple personnel moving in the target compound," Santos reported. "Appears to be at least 6 individuals, armed with what look like Alaska 47s. "Ghost Rider Dagger 2-1 is taking fire from the northeast building," came the urgent voice of the ground commander. "Request immediate suppression." This was the moment Sarah had trained for the transition from surveillance to combat, where split-second decisions would determine whether American soldiers lived or died. Chen immediately rolled the aircraft into an attack orbit, while Sarah coordinated with the ground forces to ensure positive target identification. "Dagger 2-1. Confirm location of friendly forces," Sarah said, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Friendlies are in the southern compound, taking cover behind the concrete wall. Targets are in the 2-story building to the northeast, second-floor windows." Sarah could see the muzzle flashes on the thermal display, bright white strobes indicating enemy weapons firing at the Special Operations Team. The geometry was clear, the target identification positive, and American soldiers were in immediate danger. 25 Mike, engaging the northeast building, second floor, Sarah announced. Danger, close engagement. The Gatling gun fired for only 3 seconds, but in that time it delivered 60 rounds with surgical precision. The enemy muzzle flashes disappeared immediately, and the thermal display showed no further movement in the target building. Outstanding shooting, Ghost Rider, came the relieved voice of the ground commander. Target neutralized. We're moving to clear the compound. But the mission was far from over. As the Special Operations Team moved through the compound, they encountered additional resistance from enemy fighters who had been hiding in other buildings. For the next 2 hours, Sarah and her crew provided continuous fire support, engaging targets with a precision that amazed even the experienced ground forces. Ghost Rider, this is Dagger 2-1 Actual, came a new voice. The team commander himself. I've been doing this for 12 years, and I've never seen shooting like that. You just saved a lot of American lives tonight. The extraction went smoothly, with the Special Operations Team successfully capturing their target and valuable intelligence materials. As they departed the area, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced in training. For the first time, she had used her skills to directly save American lives in combat. The flight back to Bagram gave her time to process what had happened. She had flown her first combat mission, engaged enemy forces, and proven that she could perform under the ultimate pressure. But more importantly, she had validated everything her instructors and supporters had believed about her capabilities. Over the following months, Sarah flew mission after mission, each one adding to her experience and reputation. She provided fire support for troops under attack in remote mountain valleys, conducted surveillance missions that helped locate high-value targets, and participated in complex operations that required coordination between multiple aircraft and ground units. Her reputation among Special Operations Forces grew with each successful mission. Soldiers began specifically requesting Ghost Lady, the call sign they had given Sarah when they needed close air support. Her precision with the aircraft's weapons became legendary, with troops claiming she could put rounds through specific windows from miles away. The defining moment of her deployment came during her 8th month in Afghanistan. A Special Forces team had been ambushed in a remote valley near the Pakistani border, pinned down by overwhelming enemy fire and unable to reach their extraction point. The weather was deteriorating, with low clouds and strong winds that made flying dangerous and accurate weapons employment nearly impossible. Ghost Rider 7-4, this is Raven 1-6, came the desperate call from the ground force commander. We have 8 wounded, running low on ammunition, and at least 30 enemy fighters moving in for the kill. We need immediate close air support, or we're not going home. Sarah looked at the weather display, noting the wind speeds and cloud coverage that made the mission extremely dangerous. Other aircraft had been forced to abort their missions due to the conditions, leaving the Special Forces team without support. Chen, what do you think? She asked her aircraft commander. Chen studied the weather data and shook his head. It's right at the edge of our operating limits. Visibility is marginal. Winds are gusting to 60 knots, and the terrain makes evasive maneuvering almost impossible if we take fire. Sarah thought about the 8 wounded soldiers on the ground, about the families who were counting on them to come home, about the trust that the Special Forces team was placing in her abilities. We're going in, she announced. The approach to the target area was the most challenging flying Sarah had ever attempted. The AC-130 was buffeted by mountain winds that threatened to slam it into the valley walls, while cloud cover reduced visibility to less than a mile. But Sarah's hours of training in adverse conditions served her well, and she managed to establish the aircraft in a stable orbit around the besieged ground forces. Raven 1-6, Ghost Rider is on station, Sarah announced. Send your targets. What followed was a textbook example of close air support under impossible conditions. For 45 minutes, Sarah engaged enemy positions with pinpoint accuracy while fighting the worst weather conditions she had ever encountered. Her weapons hit targets that other pilots said were impossible to engage, and her precise fire allowed the Special Forces team to fight their way to the extraction point. Ghost Rider, Raven 1-6, came the final transmission as the rescue helicopters arrived. All personnel extracted safely. You just performed a miracle out there. Thank you for bringing us home." The mission earned Sarah the Distinguished Flying Cross, making her the first female AC-130 pilot to receive the decoration. But more importantly, it established her reputation as one of the most skilled gunship pilots in the Air Force, regardless of gender. When her deployment ended, Sarah had flown 127 combat missions, engaged enemy forces on 89 occasions, and been credited with saving the lives of dozens of American service members. She had proven, beyond any doubt, that women could not only handle the demands of flying the AC-130, but could excel in the most challenging combat situations. The homecoming ceremony at Hurlburt Field drew media attention from around the world. Sarah's story had captured the imagination of military and civilian audiences alike, the small-town girl who had defied expectations to become one of America's most deadly combat pilots. But for Sarah, the real satisfaction came from a different source. Among the crowd at the ceremony, she spotted her parents, who had flown in from Nebraska to welcome her home. Her father's eyes were filled with tears of pride, and her mother held a sign that simply read, "We always knew you could fly." After the ceremony, Sarah stood alone on the flight line, looking at the AC-130 that had become her second home over the past year. The aircraft bore new scars from its deployment: patched bullet holes, replacement panels, and the wear marks that came from hundreds of hours in combat. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes approached, carrying a folder that contained Sarah's next assignment. "So what's next for the most famous AC-130 pilot in the Air Force?" Hayes asked. Sarah smiled, thinking about the 9-year-old girl who had watched fighter jets from a barn roof in Nebraska, the teenager who had earned her pilot's license despite everyone's doubts, and the young woman who had fought her way through every barrier the military could place in front of her. "I want to be an instructor," Sarah said. "I want to train the next generation of gunship pilots, men and women who can carry on this mission and prove that excellence has nothing to do with gender." Hayes nodded approvingly. "I thought you might say that. Your new assignment is to the AC-130 training squadron at Hurlburt Field. You'll be responsible for developing the curriculum for integrating female pilots into the gunship program." As Sarah looked out over the flight line, she could see the future taking shape. Tomorrow, there would be other young women arriving for AC-130 training, following the path she had blazed. They would face their own challenges, their own doubts, and their own moments of triumph. But they would also have something Sarah hadn't had when she started: proof that it could be done. The girl who had once been told that women couldn't handle the AC-130 had become the woman who would teach them how to master it. In the process, she had changed not just her own life, but the entire culture of military aviation. The war in Afghanistan would continue, and AC-130 gunships would continue to provide life-saving support to American forces around the world. But now, when those aircraft appeared in the darkness above embattled troops, some of the most skilled pilots at the controls would be women who had followed Sarah Mitchell's example of courage, determination, and excellence. The barriers were broken. The sky was open to everyone with the skill and will to claim it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.